to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody who's been involved in organising the conference and bringing it into reality. What's been interesting is this is an interdisciplinary conference. We have historians, political scientists, philosophers, scholars of Jewish studies, and more. And I'm going to be coming to thinking about some of Rabbi Sachs's contributions as a philosopher. Let me say something very controversial. I only got tenure a couple of years ago, but now I don't have to care too much because I've got tenure, so I can say things that are controversial. So I'll use that. And I'll say, I think it's crucially important that we do study Rabbi Sachs as a figure in Jewish intellectual history, and that means we need to study him as historians. But I think it's crucially important that it doesn't stop there, that he isn't only a topic for intellectual history. In fact, Jewish studies sometimes could be said to suffer from over-historicizing its topic. In fact, Rabbi Sachs speaks about this in one of his earliest books, Tradition and Non-Traditional Age, where he talks about some of the perhaps negative agendas of the Wissenschaft, the Judentum, the kind of first Germanic attempts to bring Judaism into the academy. And he quotes, Rabbi Sachs quotes a reputed statement of Moritz Steinschneider, who was one of the founders of Wissenschaft and Judentum, that the job of academic Jewish studies is to give Judaism a decent burial, right? Because Judaism is something in the past, and now the job is to give it a decent burial. And Rabbi Sachs, of course, was fixated by the future tense. In fact, that's a novel of one. That's the name. Novel. That's the name of one of his books, The Future Tense. He speaks about Judaism as a future-oriented faith, and therefore, without, and that's why I wanted to walk carefully, without meaning to denigrate Jewish studies, because I place a great and crucial import on understanding the history of our people and our intellectual history, and that does need to be done with the objective tools of a historian and a sociologist and other such tools. I think it's also important that we continue to think in Saxian ways as we look towards the future. That Rabbi Sachs informs Jewish philosophy going forward. In fact, I would say something else controversial that it's okay because I've got tenure, is that in Israel, there, and even in these hallowed halls of Bar-Ilan University, which I'm privileged to be speaking in, and I'll probably never be invited to speak at again after I say what I'm about to say. But even in these hallowed halls, we make a distinction, a sociological distinction between philosophy and Machshavit Israel, philosophy and Jewish philosophy. These are separate topics. That doesn't seem to be the way the Rabbi Sachs saw things. He wanted to bring Judaism into the conversation with non-Jewish sources, and it wasn't merely about, and somebody said this last night, and I agree full-heartedly, it wasn't merely about what the non-Jewish sources could do to illuminate or maybe make more relevant our own tradition. It was also, crucially, what our tradition has to say to the rest of the world. And if we silo ourselves off into Jewish studies, Jewish studies is very important. So is Jewish philosophy. So is the study of the intellectual history of Jewish philosophy. But Jewish philosophy should also be done as philosophy. And what it means, I think, to engage with Rabbi Sachs's work as a philosopher is one of two things. Either, as we've seen some of the talks today, is to look at what Rabbi Sachs wrote and see where there are problems, like my good friend who I've only met once in the flesh, but we've known each other over the internet for longer than that. But what Daniel Reinhold was doing today is to see where are there some contradictions or problems in the text, and using philosophical tools to try and solve those. And there were other examples I was picking out, Daniel, just because it was a salient example. There are other examples of that through this conference. I think a different way to engage Rabbi Sachs as a philosopher is to address maybe issues or problems that he didn't address, but to see what could be said in a recognisably Saxian spirit about new questions or questions to which he didn't turn. And in a sense, that's what I'm going to be doing in this talk, although I probably won't have long enough to develop the point extensively. One of the things that's come up, this is a picture of Rabbi Sachs that I found on the BBC's website for the Reith Lectures. So it was probably taken around the time of the Reith Lectures, 1990, I think, was the Reith Lectures, which were later published as the Persistence of Faith. One of the things that's come up in a number of talks today is Rabbi Sachs's affinity to communitarianism, a philosophical movement, a kind of broad philosophical movement that kind of reached perhaps a zenith in the 1980s. A number of thinkers like Alistair McIntyre, Michael Sandel, Charles Taylor, and others. And one of the salient features of communitarianism is this notion that people are situated. Again, Daniel Reinhold was speaking about unencumbered selves, the idea of a person shorn away from his or her commitments, his or her social identity, his or her history, and that kind of unencumbered self is anathema to communitarianism. Communitarianism thinks of people as fundamentally situated. And again, as Daniel pointed out, Rabbi Sachs sees that kind of conception of the self very much intimated in Jewish sources, and in kind of a halachic outlook, that people are born into covenants, they're born into networks of responsibilities, so on and so forth. Related to this communitarian conception of the self, I think there are two related strands of Western thought that Rabbi Sachs engages with. They're inherently related. One is Ludwig Wittgenstein's private language argument, which we'll speak about later, and a lot of communitarians relate to Wittgenstein's private language argument. They're kind of a package deal sometimes, they're presented as a package deal sometimes. I'm also going to say something about a school of thought, although it's probably not big enough yet to call a school of thought. It depends if one person could be a school. Called communitarian epistemology. There are actually a number of people in the literature who call themselves communitarian epistemologists, but I've condemned them, in a sense, in something I wrote as being communist epistemologists. And I think Rabbi Sachs is actually a better example of a communitarian epistemologist. I'll try and unpack what I mean by all of that as we go along. I want to start with reflections on the private language argument. In the Persistence of Faith, which were the Reith Lectures when they were published in a book, Rabbi Sachs speaks about morality as something that's inherently communal. And in passing, he says a private morality is no more possible than a private language. So it's just taken as a given in what he says that there's this notion called a private language, which is just obviously impossible. We'll say more anon. In the Faith Lectures in 2001, Rabbi Sachs makes it more explicit that he sees this in Wittgenstein's famous and fundamental point, that there can be no private language. Language is essentially interpersonal. Without interpersonality, there is no language. Okay? Now that, I suppose, would be the strongest statement of the thesis which is attributed to Wittgenstein, that there can be no private language. The basic idea would be, I mean, it might sound bizarre to you, but if you were born in a desert island and you weren't raised by humans and you had no contact whatsoever with any community at all, you would learn no language whatsoever. Now, this might sound striking. Why I'll come up with my own language? You know, I'd call coconuts, spoobies, and I'll call, trees, clonkies, whatever. I'll just give words to, and I'll come up with my own language. Why couldn't you do that? We'll talk about that later, but Wittgenstein argues that's just not possible. If you were alone, you would have no language whatsoever, and here Rabbi Sachs seems to endorse that claim without equivocation. Here, in an earlier text between the two, in Crisis and Covenant, and without speaking about Wittgenstein explicitly again, Rabbi Sachs makes a comparison that he makes often between faith and language. And he says as follows: implicit in Judaism is a deep analogy between faith and language. The language is spoken by a people. There's no such thing as a private language or a universal language. So that's interesting. So Wittgenstein talks about there being no private language. It's interesting to think about why there couldn't be such a thing as a universal language. Why, like Esperanto? Why can't there be one language that everybody speaks? And I imagine that, I'm not going to talk about this today, but if you want to think about Rabbi Sachs' approach to a universal language and the inherent impossibility of a universal language, you'd have to look at Rabbi Sachs' Perushim on the story of Babel, right, which was the attempt to establish a universal language that was aborted because of divine intervention. Of course, you may think that in the eschaton, in the messianic age, we will return to a universal language, right? And that may well be. So it might be that Rabbi Sachs, we should interpret him to be saying that in human history, there can be no private language or universal language, because Rabbi Sachs very often relates to the messianic period as beyond history, right? So you've got human history, and then you have the messianic age. Anyway, he says we're born into a linguistic community. By speaking any natural language, we are participants in the history of a civilization. Its nuances of meaning and associations were shaped by the past and yet persist into the present. And to speak a language is to internalize its rules of grammar and semantics. Without these rules, we cannot express ourselves articulately. I'm going to come back to that phrase in a minute, because actually that's dialing down the orthodox Wittgensteinian conclusion. He's not saying we couldn't think at all. He's saying we couldn't think articulately. We couldn't express ourselves articulately. Well, there's room for perhaps inarticulate expression, right? Or like less articulate expression. I'll come back to that. I love this quote. It makes me think about the fact that when we use words of a language, whether we like it or not, the words that we use carry with them generations of associations because of their use prior to us, right? So our words carry all sorts of nuances. I saw a really interesting piece by Andre Nera about what he called the conspiracy of a sacred language to reinstitute sacred connotations. He talks about the fact that the early secular pioneers of the land of Israel and the state of Israel, their choice to use Hebrew as the lingua franca, when Hebrew was the sacred language, quite unlike the Catholic model was to leave Latin for sacred matters and use the lingua franca for your secular matters. The Protestant model was to translate the sacred into the vernacular, but what the Zionists did was neither the Catholic nor the Protestant, but was to take the sacred language, Lashon HaKodesh, and to use it, oh my goodness, is that how many I've said? And just so, to use Hebrew, to use the sacred language even for our secular needs. He speaks about how A.D. Gordon, for example, Aleph Gordon would speak about the role of avodah, of labour. But when you say avodah in Hebrew, if you're a Jewishly literate audience, you think avodat Hashem, avodat HaKodesh, avodat HaMishkan. The words we use carry, they have a history. 5 minutes, oh my goodness. What was Wittgenstein's private argument, language argument? It's really not clear. In fact, it's not clear it even had such an argument. There's a massive machloket about where the argument is, what the argument is, and whether there was an argument. But one thing you could say is you could put it like this. One framing of what he may have been saying, this is in his posthumous, he published a lot posthumously, Wittgenstein. He was very active since death. Halavai, I should be so active after I've gone. But in his posthumously published philosophical investigations, he seems to make an argument something like this. language requires the establishment of and the adherence to rules. Language is governed by rules. And if there's only one speaker who makes the rules, then he can't go wrong, because he's completely in charge. And if he can't go wrong, then you've got the whole distinction between right and wrong no longer making sense. And if the distinction between right and wrong can no longer make sense, then you can't really talk about rules. And if you can't really talk about rules, then you can't really talk about language, so there can't be a language. Something like that is thought to be the argument, something like that. He asks in his remarks on the foundations of mathematics, could a solitary man calculate? Could a solitary man follow a rule? Are these questions somewhat similar to this one? Can a solitary person carry on a trade? Right, because language is for communication, language is transactional, language is public. Could you do it all on your own? Wittgenstein thinks no. He writes in paragraph 202 of the Philosophical Investigations, it's not possible to obey a rule privately. Now, he may be right. I think he's probably wrong. But nonetheless, Strawson, this is Strawson, who didn't, who was on fire, it seems, but he did recover, thankfully, so it must have been extinguished. He didn't adopt the private language argument uncritically, but he actually brings it into the world of epistemology. Like I said, could you have a communitarian epistemology? He puts the point as follows. Consider the overwhelming extent to which what we in fact perceive, the very nature or character of our conceptual experience itself, is determined by the instruction, the information we have already received from the word of others. Because our language literally structures our experience. So I see a room of people and chairs because I have the word people and chairs, but had I had a completely different conceptual scheme, I'd probably experience this world differently. So, and where did I pick up words like people and chairs? From a linguistic community. So even my experiences have been shaped by a language I acquired from outside of myself. So to apply a phrase of Wittgenstein's, says Strawson, much, perhaps most of what we see, we could not see as what we do see it as, without the benefit of such instruction. I would see things as different things if I had a different vocabulary. So if we are to say, as we must, that the knowledge we derive from testimony depends on perception, so my friend Rabbi Francis Nataf sees something and he comes and tells me that he's seen something, I believe him and I get knowledge based on testimony. He got it based on experience. But his experiences themselves were shaped by the testimony of others who taught him how to speak a language, because his language shapes the way he experiences things. So what comes first, testimony or experience? There's some kind of feedback loop. Must we equally say that the knowledge we derive from perception depends generally on testimony? Shameless self-publicity, in a book that I just published, A Guide for the Jewish Undecided, like 1 minute, like Rabbi Sachs tries to ground a communitarian conception of the self in Parshanut, I tried to ground a communitarian epistemology in the laws of conversion, because the rabbinic approach to conversion to Judaism seemed to say, as I read it, what really matters to us as your conversion panel is, are you really and indelibly committed to this people and this community? And there's much less emphasis on what do you believe, is it true what you believe, why? Well, on my reading, it's because there's a communitarian epistemology that recognises that to the extent that you're rooted in a Jewish community, you will have evidence for the Jewish faith. And to the extent that you're rooted in the Jewish community, the faith that you acquire in that context will be more likely to be resilient. 30 seconds, there are lots of enemies of private language arguments. Fodor thinks it goes nowhere because there are non-verbal animals that seem to think. Thinking requires representation, right? Representation requires some sort of language. McGinn thinks it's kind of really weird, like if God created 4 people, they could have a language, 3 people, they could have a language, 2 people have a language, if God only creates 1, no language. Like it just seems, it seems to him some sort of inexplicable quantum leap. What I like about what Rabbi Sachs is saying in Crisis in Covenant is that, no, okay, maybe we would have private languages, maybe we would, we were on Robinson Crusoe and we'd grown up like that, we would develop a language. Maybe Wittgenstein's arguments for that extreme claim don't go through, but what's clearly true is that the language would be impoverished compared to a language that we speak that's had hundreds of thousands of years worth of accrued nuances and meaning. So we express ourselves, infinitely more articulately by being located in a community. It's not that you couldn't have a language at all, it's that you couldn't have an expressive language. So what I was going to do is, I won't do any more slides, what I was going to do is use this Saxian background to approach new questions in the philosophy of worship. Aaron Siegel and I held a conference recently, and we're having a book coming out. We had a special issue with the Journal of Analytic Theology, all dedicated to the philosophy of worship. What is worship? What sorts of things is it appropriate to worship? Why is inappropriate worship inappropriate? Why does God hate idolatry so much, for example? Can we define worship? Is there a single kind of natural kind, or is there just a family resemblance of worships? But the point I wanted to make is that many of the thinkers in this list think that if you are all alone, because there are competing theories out there as to what worship is, and all of the philosophers on this list give a theory of what worship is that seems to say, yeah, you could worship if you're all alone. And I think that Avital Hazoni, and I think Rabbi Sachs would say as well, that would be an impoverished form of worship. When a Jew steps forward to worship in the Hebrew language, even if they do it all alone, they do it in Hebrew, therefore they're carrying the hopes and prayers and thoughts and nuances and associations of every other generation of people who've ever used the prayer book, and all the more so if you do it in communal prayer. But in a sense, it's not possible to pray alone if your prayer is going to be expressive and articulate, because it's going to be done in a language that requires a community. That was basically the